So we'll jump right into what social design is. We like to start with this quote about the role traditionally of a designer, and most of you would be familiar with the role of a designer as someone who interprets information after it's already been determined by someone else. In the case of social change, you see that a lot with social scientists or economists. Okay, here's what we think is going to be the best approach, so now the designer might take it on in a visual way. What we're doing now in the social design field as it's emerging is we're actually participating in the process, and we're using the process itself to move the social issue forward in a different way, making connections. Just to give a really simple analogy, those of you who may be familiar with communication design or graphic design would know that you're usually looking at form and function as the formula or the approach. So you're going to design with a form in mind, so let's say a brochure, and the brochure is going to raise awareness. That's kind of an easy way of looking at it. The way that we look at approach social design is that we're actually using participation as part of the formula. So we're doing form and function, but that's multiplied by the input, who's involved, and then you're looking at how it's implemented as a really key aspect of the approach. If you don't have participation and you don't have implementation in mind, then you're not doing social design effectively. And I'll get into that in a second with the core principles. All right, so just a couple brief things because we're going to go into depth into it, but just to give you a really cursory sense of how social design works, it's human-centered, so there's a user in mind, and it's empathetic. That means that we are always looking at who's involved. That means it's not just a one-sided thing like, oh, it's the end user. There's often who are the people in between. And what's really unique about this is that people are often actually neglected in how we do, how we work. So it's unusual to put people first and foremost in the process. The second component is that it integrates social responsibility and social justice. So if you are doing something and it's not for the purpose of positive social change, it's probably not social design. And then the third element is that it's collaborative. It's with, not for. And this is really important because the social designer doesn't assume or shouldn't assume that they know what's best for a particular group or particular case. It's all about working with people and trying to determine the outcome together. And just wanted to throw this in there, social designers have fun too. It's not, even though we're working on serious issues, it isn't about being serious all the time. Even though most of these issues are very grave and have issues that go back, you know, years, decades, whatever, people still want to have joy in their life, and the process should be joyful. So as we go through this, you'll see pictures with Post-its, you'll see people working together. The social designer tries not to be argumentative or confrontational. There's always a way to bring fun into the mix, and so just remember that as we go through this. Okay, so we're going to outline some core principles. There's a big long list here. Thankfully, this webinar will be available to you for posterity, so you don't have to write it all down, but we're going to start first and foremost with ethics and empathy. Now, what we say by ethics and empathy, I mean, the key question here is, what is the role and responsibility of the designer in society? That's really how social design started, especially at MICA. Most designers look at, well, you know, what does the client want and need, and how can we help the client? Well, in this case, there's a bit of a proactivity on the designer's part, the social designer's part, to say, what can I do to get something started? And so maybe the social designer is the one moving forward, or maybe the social designer is linking up with someone who has an issue and there's no clear sense of where to go with it. Well, ethics and empathy are so important because you want to, first of all, understand, or at least try to arrive at an understanding with the audiences and the people you're working with. That's always important, and objectivity is key as well. And then ethics is, how can you do this in as responsible a way as possible? Because when you're working with people, it's really easy to overlay your own issues and also to have your own agenda. And so you have to be really clear about what that is. And so starting up front with this, with the audience is extremely important. So the second one that we find extremely pivotal to the process is teaming and collaboration. In the social design program, we'd look at teaming as how do we work together in the graduate program. But out in the world, when you're working on these projects, teaming is critical because you want to be working on these things together with your partners. And that means that you're forming a team together. And they're often, or they should be, interdisciplinary. And for any of you who've worked with people in different fields or contexts, you know that if it was easy, everyone would do it well. And the fact is, it's really challenging. So social designers try to facilitate and enable the process in a way that everyone can contribute and be of value, but not assume that everyone is going to work exactly the same way or have the same thing to contribute. So it's really important that we find ways to work with different personality styles, to be self-aware and intentional on how we work. And then that allows us also to facilitate other types of things, like workshops, for example. Sometimes we're coming in and we're helping other people figure out how to move forward in the process. Maybe they've gotten stuck or they're just trying to look at something in a new way. So as social designers, we can come in and be objective and also help them work through some of these things in a fun and effective way. Social literacy is tenet number 3. And this is something that's extremely hard to do because whenever you go into a new context, let's say you come into the Masters in Social Design program and you're not from Baltimore, you come from another part. I am from outside of DC, so it's not that far, but I'm still coming into a city where I don't really understand all of the different issues at stake in terms of race, in terms of policy, how people work with each other, and what the history is of other types of efforts that have been going on. All of these things are interconnected and they're extremely difficult to understand. So social literacy is not just trying to get a sense of what it's like on the ground, but it's also having humility, coming in and saying, I don't know all the answers and I don't know necessarily what's right. And people will respect you a lot more if you can come in and say that instead of just saying, oh, well, this is what you need to do. If any of you have ever tried to look at a problem or an issue that's affecting you in your, exactly where you live, you'll know that sometimes it's even harder to see all of those issues when they're right in front of you. So there is value to going into a different environment and providing maybe an objective stance. At the same time, you can't do it without realizing that you need to have sensitivity of the situation and, again, be humble and ask for other people to participate because they're the ones who are really going to be the key to moving forward. So principle number 3, design research. And this is important. It's not just something you do by yourself on the internet. You want to work with other stakeholders and you want to try to define problems. You can't just go in and say, well, a lot of people will say, oh, I know what the solution is, so we're going to develop this. Well, social design would say, you don't know the solution or you can't develop solutions until you know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. One of the methods we do for this is called problem definition, where we actually redundantly say we want to define the problem. And an example of that would be that let's say there's in a neighborhood people aren't talking to each other. You might say, oh, well, we should have a monthly meeting where everyone can get together. Well, before you say let's do a monthly meeting, you have to say what is the problem we're trying to solve? Is it communication amongst the neighbors? Is it that they feel alienated from each other? Maybe there was a real estate transaction that happened a couple years ago and a whole lot of people moved out and then there's a new group of people and they don't know each other very well. So you have to really sit and analyze what are the different things that are happening in this context. And when we say qualitative and quantitative research methodologies, which is in the second sentence, what we're talking about is we use a variety of ways to collect information, and some of those are from the social sciences. And a social designer needs to be really familiar with those, even if the methodologies themselves aren't done in the same way that a social scientist might do. So design thinking, many of you may have heard of this. This is a a framework that has come out of originally from IDEO, which is a really awesome company that works globally. And the framework itself, it has empathy, define, which is also what we call research, ideation, testing, and prototyping. And it's not necessarily it's not a linear approach. There can be many different ways to enter into it and exit it and then circle around multiple times. The way we use it in social design is that we are specifically using it to address social problems. So design thinking on its own can be used to do anything, really. You could use it with a mattress company or a college, but we use it in terms of trying to help us underline the process as we go through it. And it is a really useful framework, although there are multiple ways to look at solving problems. So it's just one in our tool set. Visualization. Now, one of the things that people find really difficult out in the world is to take a huge amount of data and translate it into digestible bits of information. So the social designer, while isn't necessarily expected to be a graphic designer per se, still is anchored in the visual. We're trying often to take all this information and then find a way to make it compelling, to tell a story, and to help people understand it better. And this can be really enlightening for the people we work with because they're so used to looking at things in spreadsheets that seeing it in a form like the image on the left, for example, can all of a sudden illuminate things that they had never thought about. So it's one of the things that we try to do, and it can be difficult if you're looking at a ton of information, but it's also really gratifying when you found a way to distill it to the essence. All right, so design entrepreneurship. This is really key, and one of the things that's actually emerging from this area is that social designers, in many ways, can work with other people to advance other things, and it doesn't have to end up being an actual sellable idea. But when a designer can turn their idea into a sustainable, lasting solution, that means that you're actually addressing the problem in the long term. And instead of just kind of swooping in and working with someone and then leaving and going to do something else, you're actually putting in time to develop this idea. And in a lot of ways, we've seen a lot of success with that. So, yeah, Jonathan, before we move into your case study, do you have any input on design entrepreneurship?
It's critical in just kind of creating that sustainability, not just in terms of environmental or economic, but just kind of long-term. How do you see this change take place, and how do you make sure the change stays in a positive influence and doesn't necessarily get adopted or kind of adapted to something else or owned by somebody else?
Right. And one thing we should mention that's not covered in the principles is that social designers are heavily reliant on outside funding in order to get the ideas to, in order to basically do anything, you have to have funding if you want to be paid a daily wage. And so, you know, whether that's grants, fellowships, like Jonathan and I just completed the fellowship at MICA. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. But social designers have to be really resourceful. And so design entrepreneurship is one way to do that without just relying on grant funding all the time. If you're creating a way to actually sustain yourself, that's a win-win.